Hello and welcome to Newswire. I'm Jawad Tehami. Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan received a heroic welcome upon his arrival back to Pakistan after he goaded the world conscience about pressing global issues, particularly Kashmir, at the 74th United Nations General Assembly. During his 7 days tour to the US, he left no stone unturned to give voice to the innocent people of Kashmir, locked down virtually for over 7 decades. On the other hand, the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has been slammed by Indian National Congress and media for his failed US tour, while leaders including Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, Malaysian Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad and Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi also raised a voice for the Kashmiris at the international forum. Kashmiris who have been under lockdown for the last 57 days have hailed and thanked Prime Minister Khan for speaking for their legitimate rights as promised by the UN on the highest international forum. So to talk more about this, we are joined by Mr. Ashraf Jahangir, former ambassador, joining us from Islamabad studios. Sir, thank you for your time. First of all, Prime Minister Imran Khan was given a grand welcome when he arrived back to Pakistan for his speech at the United Nations General Assembly. How do you analyze the overall tour? And Prime Minister actually stood up to his promise of highlighting the Indian belligerent designs and the plight of the Kashmiris.
Yes, I think he deservedly received a hero's welcome back to Pakistan. His speech was very logical, very passionate, and very appropriate to the occasion. He spoke about 4 major subjects, including the all-important subject for the entire world, the subject of climate change, very specifically, briefly, but to the point. He spoke about how the rich have been looting poorer countries, including Pakistan, and salting their money abroad in rich countries. From where to retrieve it is very difficult. He then spoke about Islamophobia, which has been a catch-all phrase for everything that the West doesn't like, and equated it so easily with terrorism, and he exposed much of the hypocrisy in this regard. And then most importantly and most immediately, he spoke about the current situation in occupied Kashmir and warned the world that that unless it woke up to its responsibilities, a very, very bad situation could ensue, because India is embarked upon the crushing of a whole people, which by the definition of genocide according to the Genocide Convention is tantamount to all the elements that make up genocide. And indeed, an NGO called Genocide Watch, based in Germany, has termed the recent developments in both Kashmir and in Assam as indicative of a process of genocide underway. So it's extremely important for the world to realize how serious this problem is. Of course, the world is is considerably self-centered. It looks at its own interests. It doesn't care so much for morality or even laws. But in the end, if we ignore all of these moral considerations, the price that the world will have to pay, and particularly the poorer countries, and in particular our region, would be excessive. So I think under the circumstances, the Prime Minister acquitted himself brilliantly.
So Prime Minister has done very well there during his tour to the US. And you had just mentioned the alerts given by the Genocide Watch. There have been a couple of alerts by the Genocide Watch, and the world must take cognizance of the situation in occupied Kashmir. On the other hand, after the successful speech of Prime Minister Imran Khan at the UNGA, Kashmiris have celebrated with firecrackers, and they've hailed Prime Minister for raising their voice. Finally, vociferously, we have seen somebody raising a voice for the Kashmiris at the international forum.
Yes, of course. Even in occupied Kashmir, of course, whenever they had the opportunity to come out of their homes, they've expressed extreme appreciation for the words of the Prime Minister. And one major reason is that there has been this question which up until now has been largely unanswered. Pakistan, as you know, and Prime Minister Imran Khan has reiterated this numerous times since he assumed office, that Pakistan seeks a peaceful solution with all its neighbors, including India, with regard to any differences there might be. And with India, we have the problem of Kashmir. And he has offered dialogue. He has offered a peaceful solution in accordance with international law, which means the UN Security Council resolutions. And he has himself spoken very eloquently against war and against the consequences of war. But the question still arises that what if India, because of its frustration and its future failure, if it sort of pushes its human rights violations to the point of genocide, and if the world remains indifferent and doesn't do very much except make verbal statements, then what will Pakistan do? Will Pakistan plead its inability to do more than it is doing? Or will Pakistan regard the people of occupied Kashmir as its own people and respond accordingly? And I think the Prime Minister answered that question by making it clear that he seeks to avoid war, avoid genocide, have a peaceful solution. But if India remains so obstinate and if its actions are so criminally violative of fundamental human rights that they amount to almost genocide, then Pakistan will do what is expected of it and what it is entitled to do according to international law.
Okay, so Pakistan has always wanted to avoid war. And since Prime Minister Imran Khan took power, he offered Indian side to come to the negotiating table to resolve all the outstanding disputes. He also said that it is the test for the United Nations whether it appeases the market of 1.2 billion or stands for justice and humanity. How do you think the United Nations can play its role? Does it have any sort of mechanism in order to impress upon India that it should stop its human rights violations in Indian-occupied Kashmir?
Well, when we talk about the United Nations, we should be clear. What we are really talking about is the United Nations Security Council, and that means the 5 major powers, and not the UN Secretariat headed by the UN Secretary General. He carries out the resolutions of the Security Council and other bodies of the United Nations, and he, of course, brings things to the attention of UN bodies whenever he thinks it's necessary. So it's not the United Nations that is being cynical about its obligations. Many of the big powers, are, and we know in particular the United States and the Western powers, they know what is happening. They deplore what is happening in occupied Kashmir. They have criticized it in mild terms, and their newspapers have come up with some very strong opinions and editorials and op-ed articles, about what India is doing. But when it comes to taking action in order to bring pressure on India to revise or retreat from its decision of August the 5th, which is in violation of international law, practically cancels a similar agreement and the LOC, which derives from the similar agreement, and eliminates the possibility of dialogue, then the international community was expected, including the United Nations, to raise its voice to the point where it should tell in no uncertain terms India that its actions are raising the possibility of war. And in this respect, the United Nations Secretary General under Article 99 of the UN Charter has the right and the option of approaching the UN Security Council if, in his opinion, a situation threatening the peace is developing. And since India and Pakistan are nuclear-armed powers, and we've recently had a conflict situation last February, I think it would be appropriate for the United Nations Secretary General to approach the Security Council, because an extraordinarily dangerous situation.
And what exactly are those measures, Ms. Ashraf, that Security Council can take forcefully or in order to impress upon India to stop its violations in occupied Valley?
Well, I think it's very obvious because, there are UN Security Council resolutions. India is already in violation of those resolutions when it annexed Kashmir. However, the recent action, we were hoping for a process of dialogue to take place with regard to this difference. However, since August the 5th, India has eliminated the possibility of dialogue with Pakistan, eliminated that possibility, and it's gone into a totally new stage where war becomes much more probable than it was before. And therefore, the Security Council could ask India to revise the decision, to take back the decision of August the 5th, because that has changed the situation inside occupied Kashmir in violation of the similar agreement itself.
Mr. Ashraf Qazi, former ambassador, thank you for your time, for being with us on Newswire, joining us from Islamabad studios. He said that international community, particularly the United Nations and the major five powers, should play their role in order to impress upon India to stop its human rights violations in Indian-occupied Kashmir. And now we have been joined by Dr. Farhan Chak from Doha, Associate Professor of International Affairs at the Qatar University. Thank you for your time. We have seen two different scenarios, Dr. Farhan. On one side, we saw that a grand welcome was given to Prime Minister of Pakistan after his UN speech. On the other hand, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has been slammed by Indian Congress and media for his failed US tour. How do you compare the two different scenarios?
The illusion of what the Hindutva government has been trying to impress upon the minds of Indians is finally coming to a horrible crash. You know, they couldn't keep it up for very long. The economy is in shambles, and the amount of crimes that are committed against the minorities is increasing. So they're in a state of desperation. But I like to point out, I don't like comparisons. At the end of the day, I'd rather focus on what the target is of Pakistan, what is the target of the Kashmiris. And on that level, Prime Minister Imran Khan's speech was spectacular. It was outstanding. Never has such a forum been used in such a way to so forcefully speak about the issue of Kashmir. So his audience should first and foremost be his own constituents. And for a lot of time, a lot of leaders in Pakistan and throughout the developing world, they don't have that concept that who is your audience. But his primary audience was his own constituents, the people of Pakistan and the Kashmiris. And overwhelmingly for Kashmiris, almost in entirety, the Kashmiri people have been overjoyed at the speech at the UN and even his Islamabad airport. And just to kind of put this in perspective, after the speech at the UN, there were at least 30 recorded instances of protests naturally occurring throughout various mohalle of Maqbuza Kashmir. So that gives you an indication. It has gone viral. His speech, his commitment, his insistence that he is an ambassador for Kashmiris, it has won over every section of Kashmiri society.
Okay, it has been well received in Kashmir as well. As you have pointed out, there had been huge celebrations in Indian-occupied Kashmir over the speech of Prime Minister Imran Khan. But on the contrary, we saw that 6 martyrdoms happened after the UN speech of Prime Minister Imran Khan. The belligerent design of the Indian armed forces and the paramilitary forces over there remain unabated. So what do you think India is doing at the moment, despite the international censure, despite raising a voice by the international leaders on the World Forum as well? What India exactly is up to in Indian-occupied Kashmir?
I honestly believe they don't have a clear strategy. Right now, they are trying to, not have this in the news as much as it is. And we, the Kashmiris, Pakistanis, have to continue to keep this newsworthy. Keep it in the news as much as possible. Once it starts to disappear, I believe they're going to, open the curfew and there's going to be a bloodbath. I totally agree with the assessment of Prime Minister Imran Khan that this is what the 900,000 plus soldiers are for. This is what the radical Hindutva RSS thugs have been, almost up to 48,000 actually, to be honest, have been sent there. They were planning this genocidal attack. That's why Genocide Watch issued that genocide alert. And because of international eye, because the whole world is watching, they became apprehensive and scared. The internationalization of the conflict, I believe, has stopped a major genocide from occurring, but has not minused it from occurring. It is in all likelihood eventually going to happen once the Indians feel that the world is no longer watching.
Okay, Dr. Farhan, I'll come back to you. We have been joined by Mr. Advocate Parvez Ahmad, analyst, joining us from Islamabad studios. Thank you for your time. How do you analyze the whole situation when we talk about the successful UN tour of Prime Minister of Pakistan, Imran Khan? He very vehemently raised the voice for the Kashmiris over there and got a heroic welcome back home.
After the Imran Khan's speech to UN General Assembly, I just talked to a few of my friends in Delhi, and what they narrated that the people of Jammu and Kashmir, I mean to say the Indian occupied Kashmir, were very happy. They came on the roads and there were firecrackers, there were jubilation, and we were expecting such a speech from the Prime Minister Pakistan. It has sent positive signals to the people of the occupied Jammu and Kashmir who are under siege for the last 2 months. So it was a very wonderful speech and up to the expectations of the people of Jammu and Kashmir. And I, on behalf of All Parties Hurriyat Conference, I assure you that it has sent a positive signal to the people of Jammu and Kashmir, and now they are not tired out to what India is doing to them and what kind of atrocities India has committed upon them. But they are very much happy and facing the Indian atrocities very happily and with joy.
Okay, don't you think this US tour brought embarrassment to the Indian Premier, the highest forum of international debate and reflection, particularly during the meeting with President Trump, when a reporter was asking President Trump about terrorism? It was President Trump pointing out the Kashmir dispute between Pakistan and India, and he repeatedly offered the mediation between the two countries.
It was not only President Trump. When I was in Geneva, I came yesterday back, and when Michelle Bachelet, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, made a statement to the UN Human Rights Council, he made it clear to India that he should withdraw all these draconian laws, and besides this, she asked India to end the siege, and at the same time what she asked India that both India and Pakistan, while making any decision regarding Kashmir, should take into consideration the aspirations of the people of Jammu and Kashmir. I met different diplomats, I met human rights activists, and we were well taken in Human Rights Council, and the people whom we met, they were very eager about listening to Kashmir, what is going on in the Kashmir, and they were very much concerned. Different diplomats, different human rights activists, and even the UN staff was very much concerned. It is not only Donald Trump, but there are voices coming from different countries, from different organizations, and India wanted that this issue should not be internationalized, but luckily what India did in Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir, it backfired to India and it got internationalized, and at the same time what Prime Minister Imran Khan, the statement which he made in UN General Assembly, it was a lost try on the camel's back. So the resistance movement in the Indian occupied Kashmir will continue. After Imran Khan's speech to UN General Assembly, he even made it clear to international community once this lockdown is lifted, once the curfew is lifted, what will be next. And I'm telling you with clarity that once the curfew will be lifted in Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir, people will be on the streets. Once we have a little information,
is lifted, people will show more resistance. Parvez, you've already mentioned it was not only President Trump who raised the voice for the Kashmiris and urged India to normalize its relationship with Pakistan. It was Malaysian Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad who said that despite UN resolutions on Jammu and Kashmir, the Muslim majority region has been invaded and occupied. Does it not speak volumes that even in the 21st century, it is the might that seems to be right, and that is working out for India, especially when we talk about its subjugation of Kashmiris?
No, as a son of the soil, I am from Indian occupied Kashmir. I will say from the Kashmiri perspective, because what I have seen how the people of Jammu and Kashmir has reciprocated to the Prime Minister's speech in Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir. You cannot imagine that Jammu and Kashmir is an apple-rich state. We have the apple of millions and billions of rupees. The people of Jammu and Kashmir are not picking these apples from their orchards and left it there because it should not send a message to international community that there is a normalcy. They have opened the schools. The people of Jammu and Kashmir are not sending their children to the schools that it should not convey a message to international community that there is a normalcy. They are trying their best because it is a writing on the wall what India has read from the Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir. They have read the mood of the people of the Jammu and Kashmir. They are not going to give up. And I think our courage, our steadfastness and our sacrifices will force India to negotiate.
The courage and the sacrifices are not stopped by the Indian armed forces through force. India has to come to some sort of negotiating table and talk about the resolution of Kashmir dispute. Dr. Farhan Mahathir Mohamad, the Malaysian Prime Minister, also said that ignoring the UN will lead to other forms of disregard for the United Nations. Does this statement highlight the fact that some nations like India have a sheer disregard already for the UN resolutions?
Absolutely. It has clearly shown that India completely disregards the UN resolutions. And funny enough, for so long they were trying to, position themselves to be on the Security Council. So they can throw that right out the window. On every level, this has been a disaster for India. So I am sure inside they must be seething at the mistake after mistake that the Modi government is making. But it wasn't just Malaysia. China also came out and said, and to be honest, before Russia even in a shock move has alluded to the resolutions on Kashmir late August. So there is a growing recognition. And I think there has been so much obfuscation, confusion that India perpetuates that what needs to be done is to clearly highlight that these are people, they have their rights that were guaranteed by the UN resolutions on the matter, and this is not a bilateral issue, and especially now after what they've done, it's inconceivable for it to be a bilateral issue. It's an international issue, and Kashmiris are not Indians, and it is not an integral part of India. So these sound bites need to become repeated constantly, but looking at it from the Indian perspective is also important. They view this as an existential threat to their very being. So there's a long discussion on why they've been able to do that. But as much as we need to chip away. And most importantly, I'd like to mention also and acknowledge the President Erdogan's support for Kashmiris, which was really amazing. And it was so hard-hitting, so much so that some Indian journals started to publish, that they're going to now reach out to Armenia, which is, again, just going to further alienate the Turkish society from any kind of overtures towards India. So this is all
voices are being raised by the world leaders, just like Malaysian Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad and Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi and Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan also raised voice at the United Nations General Assembly. Dr. Farhan Chak, you are joining us from Doha, Associate Professor of International Affairs at the Qatar University. Thank you for your time. Mr. Parvez, what do you think? There was a statement that I would like to quote from the speech of Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, that he said that India had been creating buddhas rather than yuddhas. That means India has not been wanting to create war, but rather it had been creating personalities like Buddha, so whose teachings were love and compassion towards humanity and all the living creatures. How do you analyze this statement when he delivered that statement at the United Nations General Assembly? Do you think it is in consonance with the policies and the methods the BJP-led government is pursuing in India for the Muslims and also in Indian-occupied Kashmir?
Sir, it is you can yourself judge that the people of Jammu, 80 8 million people are in the cage for the last 2 months. At the same time, they are showering pellets and bullets up to the people of Jammu and Kashmir. At the same time, he is talking of Buddha. This may be his public posturing, but what he is doing in Jammu and Kashmir, who understands better than me? I have not been in a position to talk to my mother for the last 2 years, ailing mother. I'm not in a position to talk to my father, although they have been sending messages to me that they have the courage and they are going to fight India up to the last, because India is trying to make the public posting that India has stands exposed, because if we go in the mainland India, the cow is getting more respect than a Muslim. You see, for beef, Muslims are being killed. You see, in the state of Assam, the immigrants who have been settled there for the last 50, 60 years, they are being asked to leave the country. You might have seen that in the European countries, if a person stays for 4 or 5 years, he is getting the nationality. You see how India is behaving with those people who have been settled in there, because they are the Muslims who have migrated from the East Pakistan. And what he is doing in Kashmir, he has imposed curfew. There is no access to the hospitals. The pregnant women do not get access to the health care.
So everyone can see what exactly India is up to in Indian-occupied Kashmir, not only in Indian-occupied Kashmir, but also over there in India itself, where there are Muslims. So quite a belligerent designs. Mr. Advocate Parvez Ahmad, analyst and executive member of All Party Hurriyat Conference, Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir, joining us from Islamabad studios. Thank you for your time. Here we'll take a short break, and after we return, we will discuss post-Afghan presidential election scenario. Stay with us. We'll be back in a bit. Welcome back to Newswire. Afghanistan is on a gradual yet bumpy road to democracy after decades of war and strife among various stakeholders. The war-torn country witnessed a fourth presidential election after the Taliban government was toppled by the US-led coalition in 2001. Initial statistics by the Independent Election Commission suggest that voter turnout hit the record low, estimated to be lesser than 25%. The elections were held amid tight security owing to the threats of violence by Taliban. Interior Ministry said that there were 5 deaths owing to 68 assaults by the enemy. However, Taliban have claimed to have carried out over 500 attacks. Afghan authorities and the UN chief Antonio Guterres have commended Afghans for showing courage in exercising their right to vote. Can this presidential election be considered as credible as to the low turnout, and what impact it will have on the long-term peace in Afghanistan? To talk about this, we are joined by Mr. Gul Maqsood, former Deputy Finance Minister, and Mr. Javid Faisal, a former government spokesperson, both joining us from Kabul. Thank you, gentlemen, for your time. I will start with Mr. Faisal Javed. How do you see the overall electoral process? The turnout specifically was very low as compared to the previous elections in 2014.
I think it was a win for Afghanistan. The first time we are holding our elections completely on our own. The security was provided completely by the Afghan security forces. We did not receive any assistance from the international community. The countries in the region were not very friendly to the process either, so they did not help it anyways. But we were able to hold it completely on our own. It was a success, first of all, a success for Afghanistan, for the Afghan people, for our democracy, for our republic. And against the terrorists and against the enemies, internal and external enemies of Afghanistan, because they didn't want the process to happen. So while it was a success, in the meantime, there were also that we were considering that should have been better, like the turnout. But because of the Taliban threats and because of not having the provincial council's election, the turnout was not that much as expected. But then also when you look at the fears, when you look at the people who were saying it is not going to happen, it's still a big success. I think it's a shame for the Taliban to claim that they have attacked their own people 500 times in a single day just because they were exercising their civil right. to vote, their citizen right. I think it's a shame for them. If they want a future in this country, if they want a future with their people, they have to accept the realities and they have to start working with their fellow Afghans for a better future, not to disrupt the processes like election. Afghanistan has changed. It's no longer their Afghanistan. It has changed, and they have to adopt these new changes in our society.
Mr. Javid, you already said that this is a victory or a success of the Afghan people to have held this election. When we talk about, when we compare the two different turnouts, this time around it was lesser than 25%. The last time in 2014, it was in between 50 to 60%. I mean, how do you see, I mean, there is a huge sharp decline, less than 25% and in between 50 to 60%. How do you compare? Do we consider it real success?
Of course, it is a success. In the law that we have here, in our laws, no single place where you see a limit for the voters' turnout. And I think it's not just Afghanistan. Look at the world. You will see it anywhere too. So the thing is, the fact that we are holding an election and it's on our own and it's the cleanest election ever, there is no fraud, and there are no other shortages. We are using technology, and these are all real votes. So in the past, you also had claims of fraud. You had also worries in other areas. But this time, we are using technology. We had proper voters registration.
There have been a couple of complaints regarding the technology and certain technical glitches as well. Mr. Javed, what do you think? The security was a major concern, but the figures which are being given by Interior Ministry suggest that Taliban's offensive towards the electoral process didn't have that scale as it was being feared. Interior Ministry has said that 5 soldiers died in 68 assaults. So how do you see this particular figure?
The thing with Taliban, what they did on that day, they had rockets. The rockets were falling anywhere, like they could have landed anywhere, but luckily we had no casualties from them. Taliban were firing the rockets against the will of the Afghan people, and but luckily the Afghan security forces, they had additional measures on that day, and they made sure that the Taliban attacks do not take the lives of the Afghan people and do not disrupt the process. We knew that they were receiving support and advice and assistance from elsewhere, and that was the plan to disrupt this democratic process in Afghanistan. But we and our security forces were able to make sure that the process is happening, that Afghans are safe, and that we are not being avoided from exercising our citizen rights by the Taliban or those forces that are proxies of others.
Okay, so the figures which are given by Taliban are quite contradictory to what the figures have been given by the Interior Ministry. They have claimed to carry out around over 500 attacks. So which one do we think is a credible figure? Because as we have seen, the turnout has been low, and that particularly mentions that the people were in fear and they didn't come out in large numbers to cast their vote.
You know, you are operating from a country that recognizes the Afghan government as the legitimate government of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. And the numbers that they have put out, now you cannot decide between the Taliban and the government which figures to believe. They are a terrorist group. They are not a state. They are not a government.
Okay, some independent observers, Mr. Faisal, have said that the election was marred by technical glitches as well. Were those only related to biometric system, or there were any others? We have heard the reports of people's name missing from the voter list as well.
We had some issues with the voters lists as well. We had some issues in some places with the biometric devices too, but then the commissions were prepared and they had backups. As soon as they were encountering the problems, they were coming across with solutions and with replacing those devices and making sure that the name problem is also solved. Like one could vote if their name was on the voters list or in the database or in the biometric device. So they could vote from anywhere, and it was a smooth process. It was a success. I know there were some shortages, but those were very few, very many, and these many and small issues, those were not considered as a big hurdle.
There were certain technical glitches, certain problems with the voters list as well over there, but you consider them very small problems related to the electoral process. We have now been joined by Mr. Gul Maqsood Sabit, former Deputy Finance Minister, joining us from Kabul. How do you see the security apparatus? Were there ample stringent security measures? Was it actually the success of that apparatus that the number or the figures of the fatalities or the attacks given by the Interior Ministry are not so high during the electoral process?
Well, I think it was a great success in summary. Security forces were able to manage the situation very well. We expected a worse security situation, but they were able to manage it very well. There were minor clashes, minor incidents, but not anything major. But again, I want to go back to the turnout. There were a number of reasons in addition to security. There was an issue of a number of politicians actually stayed out of the elections too, because they wanted to prefer a peace over the elections. That was also one major area actually that needs to be looked at, in addition to security. And also we have had issues with elections in the past, in 2014, where people voted, but eventually a national unity government came into existence. So we may have lost a little bit, trust in
Faisal, the United States has repeatedly called on the candidates to shun fraud, urging for transparency and accountability. Afghan people have also demanded the authorities to prevent fraud. Whom do you think is this time around, what measures have been taken by the authorities to prevent fraud?
I don't think what the US wants is not very important for us. What that one people want is very important for us. And that one people wanted transparency. They wanted clean election. And the government, alongside the IEC, the Independent Elections Commission, made sure that there were additional measures in place to make sure that elections are clean and there is no fraud, and that the people's votes are counted, and that the people's votes will be the decision-making factor in this process. So we had introduced new technology. That was the one good area, and that's why we are having very good elections. Like as far as we know right now, we had very good and clear election. And also the voters list and the people where they were registered, they could only vote there, but their name had to be on the list either or on the biometric device that is in that center. I think these were good measures that we took, and then there were observers all over the places. We had them all from the tickets, like from certain candidates, and we had observers from observing agencies, from the watchdogs.
There were watchdogs and observers also monitoring the whole process. Mr. Faisal, whom do you think is the favorite candidate this time around, Mr. Ashraf Ghani or Mr. Abdullah?
Well, if you looked to the past, to the case the candidates had in Kabul, and sitting President Ashraf Ghani, he was holding big rallies in Kabul, and then he also was the first one to move to the provinces. He had rallies all over the places, east, west, north, and in the south. So given that, in his popularity in that one public, the things that he have done for the country, the main thing that we are now less relying on our neighbors, I think given all these factors, he should be the front runner, and and there shouldn't be no need to go for a runoffs or a second round. Things will be. I think the Afghan people have made the decision in the first round, and that the sitting president will be the leading candidate.
Or do you think that the sitting president could be the victorious this time around in the presidential election as well? Mr. Javid Faisal, thank you for your time joining us from Kabul, former government spokesperson. Mr. Gul, what do you think this election would have an impact on the long-term peace process in Afghanistan, especially when the dialogue between the US and Taliban is stalled?
Well, a number of people in Afghanistan, especially key figures, political figures, as I mentioned earlier, they preferred peace over these elections. And a number of common people, common Afghans, preferred peace at the same time. But since peace negotiations were stalled, then I think it was a good thing that we went ahead with the elections. A democratic process was implemented. I think in the future, it will depend on the kind of government that will come to existence as a result of these elections. Now, turnout was low. A government should bring in key figures, political figures, influential figures into the government. That will make it a stronger platform to negotiate with the Taliban. And I think those negotiations will be more effective and widely accepted among Afghans. I think the elections and then the government, a stronger government, as a result of this, that includes all, is a good opportunity for future.
A stronger government would be that which will include almost stakeholders in Afghanistan, and it will depend upon the structure of the government, that how does it impact the long-term peace process in Afghanistan. Mr. Gul Maqsood Sabit, former Deputy Finance Minister, joining us from Kabul. Thank you for your time. And that's all from Newswire today. We'll see you soon with an in-depth analysis from around the world. Till then, it's goodbye.